Welcome everyone. We are doing this Ask Me Anything session with Dr. Krushnamegh Kunte as part of the Lab and Focus initiative, which is part of our attempt to show everyone a little bit behind the scenes of each lab on our campus, which is the Bangalore Life Science Clusters campus. And today we are going to be taking all of your questions. So Dr. Kunte is skilled and an expert in biodiversity and evolutionary biology. And he also takes amazing photographs of wildlife and has a lot of people in his lab who he supports, and many citizen science initiatives and all kinds of activities happen within the lab and outside it. So we really want to give you this opportunity to ask him questions about his career and anything else you have questions for him about. So I'll hand it over to Krushnamegh. Thank you for doing this. And everyone, once again, please put your questions in the Q&A box.
Hi everyone, good evening. I'm very pleased to be able to chat with you. I see that about 18 people have joined. There is no particular agenda since it says ask me anything. You can really decide what are the burning questions that you want to ask me. And there's a Q&A box at the bottom. You can just put your question there and then I can address those. You can also raise your hand or ask Pavitra to maybe unmute you, and then you can ask your questions. But we prefer that you put your questions in the question and answer box first so that we can pick up questions in the order which might be a little bit nicer, and or we'll of course go with more exciting questions first. And I'll particularly like to take questions from younger students and other people who are not particularly in the academia. And if you have any questions, comments, any interesting observations that you want to share and then ask questions, you're welcome to. So when you put up anything in Q&A, maybe in that box also put a word or two about who you are and what kind of things that you would like to ask. Yeah? Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
So right now, does anyone have any questions to start with? Okay, maybe I will ask a question. So Krushnamegh, I think in our past discussions, you've mentioned that you enjoyed spending time in the forest as a child, right? Mm-hmm. So how early did that start? Before you could walk, or how was it?
Not before I could walk, but certainly pretty early on, as it goes for most of the Indian kids. So I was in 6th grade when I did my first nature camp. This was in at the end of 1984. I hope that most of the people who are joining were not even born at that time. Hopefully, because then it just means that there are a lot of young people joining. So in 84, 85, there was a nature camp in Andaman Nicobar Islands. I'd never actually, I think as far as I remember, I'd never gone out of state. I grew up in Maharashtra, and the first long trip I made was to Andaman Nicobar Islands. Beautiful forest, I really loved it. And then I asked my parents to send me again on nature camp. So in the next 3 or 4 years, I did 4 more camps. And on my 4th camp, I decided I loved all the forests and going out in forests, watching birds, chasing snakes so much that I decided that I would make a career in what I thought was, nature. I did not know at that time that there was something called a career in science as a scientist. I grew up in Pune at a time and in a community where there was no understanding that there was no concept of becoming a scientist. Everything was just, we had a lot of bird watchers around, but no scientists really. So there was really nobody to guide me. So after that, I was bouncing around for a little bit, trying to understand what does it mean to be a bird watcher or a naturalist or a nature lover, and eventually a wildlife or an ecologist and evolution biologist. But thankfully, I came in contact with somebody called Professor Milind Watwe, He was a professor in Garwari College in microbiology department at the time when I met him. And through him, I got to learn a lot about nature, about natural history, about wildlife, and more importantly, about evolutionary biology. So the early training I got in evolutionary biology and ecology and biology in general, I would say, was from him and all the people who used to meet at his house for these weekly kattas was what we called it. So that is how I started, and after that, I've just been running into really wonderful people who have helped me grow as a scientist and grow as a person. So that was the beginning. So even if it was not before I had any inkling of what biology is, I at least started early enough when I was small enough that I had no idea what doing science or being a scientist means. So my whole worldview has really been shaped by my love for nature and my passion for all sorts of animals, but especially from 11th and 12th grade, butterflies. That is what I really got hooked onto from that early age. So I think that is what has really shaped me as a person, as a professional person, as a scientist, as a PhD student, and now as a faculty member.
Okay, that's awesome to hear that, even before you thought of science, you thought of nature and everything, right?
Hmm.
So we have a couple of questions already.
Hmm.
So Rahul asks about the scope in taxonomic studies after PhD, especially
Hmm.
with moths.
Hmm. Hmm. So there is that question about taxonomic studies. Then Ganeshwari has asked a question about something to do with DNA sequencing, and our PCR is not working. So we'll get to that kind of questions a little bit later. There are more specific questions, and some of which we may never get to because these things are better addressed perhaps one on one. Whereas the kind of question that Rahul has asked, I think is interesting because a wide range of people may be interested in understanding things about career or about picking up certain kinds of problems that they can address. So we'll talk about those first. Um, Arna Seshan has also asked, what do you like the most in science? So I will try to answer both those questions at the same time. The answer is not, of course, the same, but I will at least start addressing both the questions. So, my biggest advice to anybody who's looking for advice of any kind is what you want to do should really come from you. Nobody should be able to tell you, or you should not go to anybody else for advice on what you could do, what is going to be fruitful to do. And that slightly goes back to what Rahul asked, scope of taxonomic studies after PhD in special reference to moths, right? So as far as I'm concerned, and I will give you a different answer than what anybody else give you. Yeah? So my answer is don't really care about what is the scope for work, right? And that work could be maybe you're asking about research work, maybe you're asking for career opportunities. Will you get a job, for example? And my honest answer is you really shouldn't care whether there's going to be job opportunities, whether it's considered a career, whether it is considered a prestigious career, whether it's considered something that the society needs. You, as a young person, really should not take up something that the society needs or what anybody else tells you is interesting or important. Ideally, you should find your passion. If you have a passion, burning passion that you really want to pursue, I guarantee you, if you have the passion, and of course, if you have the abilities to do those things, right? If you take a person like me of my body frame, and if I tell you that I want to become a professional football player, I'm not going to be able to do it. If I have a passion for playing football at the age of 50, I'm not going to be able to get into professional footballing, right? So you have to have passion and you have to have natural abilities. Athletically, I mean, physically, I've not been as athletic a person as you would like for, let's say, a boxer or some kind of a career. Similarly, in the intellectual field, you may be very smart, but you also have to be able to ask interesting questions if you want to be a scientist. So you have to have certain abilities, you have to have certain skills of trying to connect different pieces of information that you get. So if you can get a lot of information, you can be a good reporter. You can be a good teacher, perhaps, if you can also explain your information to other people in a nice way. But to be a scientist, you really need to be able to gather all the information that is required and then able to ask interesting questions. So just being smart is not good enough. So it takes a whole lot of skills, a lot of preparation, a lot of sharpening of your senses and your mind before you can be a good scientist. So is there a scope in taxonomic studies after PhD? Absolutely. I still describe new species. I still go to the field much more than perhaps most other faculty members or every single faculty member I know, and I managed to do that. I managed to do a lot of field work in all parts of India, and I still managed to do taxonomic work, molecular work, evolutionary work. So it's not really what I have been told is important for the society. This is what I really feel passionate about. And over the years, I've proven myself that I'm good at certain things in terms of running the lab, in terms of asking interesting questions, writing papers that people like to read. So the career opportunities that you are looking for after PhD really come from what you want to do. And I work on butterflies, which everybody likes, no problem. If you work on anything else, that's interesting. If you work on elephants, there's nobody who's going to say this is either irrelevant or society doesn't care about what you're doing. But even if you're working on something as stupid sounding, like let's say cockroaches. I mean, who would want to work on cockroaches, right? Almost every person you will meet is going to be grossed out by cockroaches. But if that is your passion, then you should absolutely pursue it. Now, the interesting thing about cockroaches, if you have followed up literature, scientific literature, and scientific research in the past few years, there's millions of dollars being spent on cockroach behavior. Because the interesting thing is, cockroaches, as you might have discovered if you have ever looked into a drainage, they congregate, and they congregate in really places that we find awful. But then so once you get over this initial impression that you have of the cockroach, the interesting question you ask is, how do cockroaches know where to congregate, right? Which cockroach decides this is a good place, this is where we should hang out, right? So then you start going from an individual decision to a group decision. So something that you're so grossed out by, like a cockroach, and nobody in the right mind would think that there is a career to be made asking interesting questions about cockroaches, can actually make a good career out of this. And I will tell you, there are computer scientists working on this problem, there are mathematicians working on this problem, there are military researchers working on this problem, because all of these people find it interesting to understand how this group decision is made. So you might think that nobody cares about moths, nobody will care about taxonomy of moths. But if you have a knack for telling a good story when you find a nice new species, and there are a ton of moths which have not been described in India, there are literally hundreds, if not, I mean, hundreds, if not thousands of species which remain to be described from India. Yeah, many of them are going to be spectacular. Moths are, most people will tell you that moths are dull. Most people will tell you that there's not much interesting about moths. That is absolutely wrong. It just requires you to go get up close with a moth. Then you will see a lot of color, you will see a lot of beauty, and you will see a lot of interesting behaviors. You will see very interesting biology. Silk production is something that we have tapped all this time. If you want to do taxonomy, you could do taxonomy of groups of moths which are important. You could, for example, do taxonomy of moths which are important crop pests. If you discover, for example, that what people thought was one really damaging moth turns out to be, let's say, 5 different species of moths which specialize on certain kind of crops, then of course it's going to be easier to manage those specialists rather than a journalist which can escape any kind of pesticide you might develop, any kind of pheromone trap that you might develop, or anything else. So the questions you ask define how good a scientist you are, and the kinds of things that you publish, of course, define that. So there's absolutely a scope to make a career as a scientist in anything that you can imagine. Any group of organisms, any kind of study, whether it's ecological, evolutionary, genetic, environmental, it's really the ability for you to make a great career in this field really is limited by how innovative you can be in designing a question, designing an experiment, and then finding interesting answers that you can put out to your scientific community or public in an interesting way. So I'll stop there. Um, what was my most exciting experience in the field is not one. I cannot give you one answer. I've been going to the field for 32 years now, as of this year. And in 32 years, I've gone to three continents, four continents. And I really cannot um give you one answer. But some of the most exciting things that I've experienced are elephants chasing me. That was one of my biggest thrills while I was doing field work in Madumalai National Park back in 94, 95. And I've been mock chased by elephants many times after that. But that has been one of the most exciting experience. Finding new species has been some of my most exciting experiences. So when I realized that there was a butterfly which had never been described, which had never been collected and investigated properly, and when I realized that I had found such a butterfly, was extremely exciting. I mean, imagine something that nobody knew and nobody had realized is a new species, and you certainly then realize that this is something very exciting. That, I bet you, is one of the most thrilling experiences of my life and anybody's life who has worked in the field. Uh, Another thing which was not exactly in the field, but my understanding that led to this discovery was very much what I knew from the field. So the first time when I realized that butterflies, especially these swallowtail butterflies that I've studied for my PhD, and since then as my primary bread and butter professional focus of my lab has been on that system, I realized that those butterflies follow a very different evolutionary trajectory. If you have followed up this work, then this is something that you might know, Darwin's theory of sexual selection. And most people think that butterflies evolve these really wonderful wing patterns. Birds have these very bright color patterns because of sexual selection. But I discovered that the mechanism, the selective agent which causes butterflies to have very different wing patterns, to change wing patterns, was not because of Darwin's sexual selection theory, but because of Wallace, who was contemporary of Darwin, who had a certain framework through which he could explain that females are actually under much stronger pressure compared to some of these male traits that Darwin and others were talking about. And he pointed out that actually the stronger selection on female will lead to divergence of females from these patterns rather than males becoming different. So uh, that insight into a very interesting principle of how males and females might diverge from each other and under what kind of selection. I had that question because I already had all the field observations I needed, and I had gone through drawers upon drawers of specimens in museums that I knew the diversity of coloration you see in swallowtails, the kind of behaviors that they show, and other things. So essentially, I had all the pieces that you need to generate an understanding, to raise a hypothesis, and then to test it from the field, even if the thought came to me when I was sitting in a lab. Similarly, I had an interesting idea that when butterflies or any other insects go to a flower to take nectar, they don't have to go to every flower, and the journey to that thought, and I'll tell you what is the logic behind it, came from a field observation. So when I was observing butterflies in the field, and this was college days, you don't have to be a well-known scientist or you don't have to have a big lab to ask interesting questions. I had been watching butterflies when I was in college, junior college, 11th, 12th grade. I had started noticing that when butterflies land on an inflorescence, a bunch of flowers, they don't probe in every single flower when they land on the inflorescence. They probe a few flowers and then fly off to another inflorescence on the same tree, or they completely take off from the tree and go somewhere else. Now, if you think about it, why will a butterfly leave a flower patch? If flower patches are normally rare, getting to an interesting flower which might have interesting in the sense of a flower which has a lot of nectar that a butterfly may be interested in. When you find it, why will you not probe all the flowers and just move on, right? And I had not even realized that I had made this observation, but I had been watching butterflies a lot. And this is one of the things that make you a good observer and then make you a good scientist. In the back of my mind, I had been accumulating all these observations, and I had never put these aside as saying this is, trivial. You see butterflies feeding from flowers all the time. Why would you bother to note down these things and keep a track of these things in your brain or in your notebook? But somehow it turns out I was always a good observer, and I was always good at retaining these observations. And then it turned out when this dawned on me that I could ask interesting questions based on all these observations I had in my mind that I didn't even know of. So I realized that there was a question to be asked. How is it that these butterflies move on without actually probing in all the flowers? Because even if they get a little bit of flower nectar in that flower, they can still go to the flower, take it, and then move on, right? Moving on is always an option. But perhaps coming back to the flower or that inflorescence is going to be more costly because you're just going to spend more energy doing that. So to build all this reasoning from an observation which would have seemed obscure, and to be able to have enough observations to even understand that there's a pattern, that I think is a genius of a scientist. And it turns out that even as a kid, I had some interesting questions. Now, this question itself was not a genius question, but it was certainly an interesting question. And the thing to do as a scientist is to build this sort of questions enough that ultimately you're going to start asking more interesting questions as you get more and more training. And as you start wading through all your observations and all your questions and making these connections between observations and between different questions, that is what then makes you a good scientist and perhaps even a terrific scientist. So that is how you build these things. Anyway, so uh, making these discoveries in your head that there's an interesting observation and then there is an interesting question to be asked, that I think is a lot of thrill for a scientist, not just the sheer adrenaline that you feel when, let's say, an elephant chases you. And don't get me wrong, in no way I'm saying that one is better than the other. I fortunately still have both the excitements in my life. Even if I'm 47, I still am fit enough to go to the field and outrunning an elephant, which is a good thing. But I also have this extremely thrilling experience of coming up with exciting questions almost on a daily or a weekly basis, and that's always good, right? So this is, I think, the excitement of field you have to change in your mind what you perceive as excitement of field. Fieldwork can be exciting both because how you feel in your brain when you're watching these things, not just the adrenaline. So I will end on that note that for me, field has been both these things. Yeah. Okay, what is my favorite Lepidoptera species? Man, you're asking me very, very difficult questions. You're asking me questions like if you have 5 kids, which one is your favorite? If you have a class of 60 students, really good students, you're asking me in front of a class, which is your favorite student, right? As a scientist or as a teacher, you will never say, here is my favorite student. Or as a parent, you will never say, here is my favorite kid. How do I tell you which is my favorite species? Of course, butterflies are not going to complain if I say, or they're not going to feel sad if I say that they're not my favorite species. But this question means that there are going to be some properties of butterflies or my experiences because of which I connect with some species more than I connect with others, right? But again, with 32 years of experience, I've accumulated so much familiarity, so much love with so many species that picking up one is going to be difficult. But for sure, I will tell you the banded-tit butterfly that I discovered, which I described as a new species. Other people had seen it before. They just hadn't realized that this was a species which had never been described scientifically, and people had even misidentified it. And I realized that that was a misidentification, and it was a very distinct species. So because I've lived with that species for 6 years before I actually described it, I think that long track record of that species being a species only in my brain has created a special bond that makes that one of my favorite species. There's a butterfly called Kaiseri Hen. It's a beautiful species. Actually, earlier, Pavitra had asked me whether I was going to share any images or files. And I had said to her that depending on what kind of questions people ask, I might share something. And now I'm going to share something with you. So the species I am talking about, it's called Kaiseri Hen, and I'm going to put up a picture of that. Just a minute. It's a beautiful, brilliant, metallic green butterfly. It's actually black, but it's covered completely with extremely brilliant metallic green scales. You won't believe. I mean, if you see it from a distance, considering how your vision has been trained, you will actually think that it's a wrapper. Yeah, it's that crazy. But um, it's a super butterfly, and I'm going to share a picture of it with you so that you can see how crazy it looks. Just a minute. There, can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a butterfly. This is definitely one of my favorite species. And there are lots of people who have gone around watching butterflies for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and they have never seen this species. I myself, having gone to Eastern Himalaya and Northeast India so many times, I've seen this species only twice. So it's certainly a very special species, and I'm just fortunate to be able to see this more number of times than many other people might have seen. And of course, if you live in some of these areas where this species occurs, it's certainly something that you might have seen more number of times. But just the fact that you, for years and years and years, you wait to see a species and it turns out to be such a stunning species beyond what you could imagine. I mean, you can look at this in a museum, you can look at this in pictures, but man, when you go to the field and you're walking down the road when you don't know that the species exists there, and suddenly your eyes fall upon this species just sitting there waiting for you, which is what this butterfly was doing. It was by a stream and it was sipping water from this stream side. So this is what it was doing. So when you end up seeing something like this, that just again makes a very special bond. And I had that bond with this butterfly already by the time I saw this, and then I saw it again. So I can go on and I can probably tell you 50, 60, 100 species which are my favorites because of this kind of experiences I've just shared with you too. But I could go on. I'm going to pick up one particular question primarily because I'm going to stop sharing. Just a minute. Let me look at Q&A. This question is from an old friend, Parag Patwardhan. So I'm just going to quickly read his question. Good to hear you after a long time. My question is, how do you keep the love and passion for science alive? Does it reach a saturation point on some days? And if it does, how do you discover the passion, rediscover the passion? Parag, very nice to see you here. And thanks for making time. Parag, by the way, is a scientist, and he has been a scientist for as long as I've been a scientist. He's also a good scientist and, of course, a terrific person. I've really enjoyed my time with him, and he has seen me since I was in college, before people knew me as a scientist. and before people knew that I had any talents. So he has known me from that time, so I'm happy to take that question. And I will add a little bit to what Parag said. I will tell you that there's a very rosy picture of being a scientist that a lot of scientists pose. And I will also tell you that groups which are out of really genuine belief that science is a very good profession and being a scientist is one of the best things that you can do. And I believe that. I honestly believe that. But I look around and I do know that a lot of scientists feel frustrated. A lot of teachers feel frustrated with what they have to deal with. A lot of scientists feel frustrated about what they have to deal with in research institutions. And I have another friend called Adeshani, another really old friend, great person. And he heard, I think one of these Nobel laureates say that being a scientist and being in academia are two very different ball games. And man, I wish that were not the reality, but unfortunately it is. And maybe Parag's question taps into that frustration as well. How do you keep your love and passion for science alive? And if the glorious version of being a scientist is what everybody believed in, and if everybody fails, then we would have to ask these questions. But because there's so much that we have to deal with in this job, that I think it is a genuinely important question. And I'm not saying that science, being a scientist, is any different. I'm pretty sure if you go to any other field, being an artist is not hard. How do you keep your love for art alive when you know that there's so much commercialization of what perhaps is seen like is considered to be more prestigious art? You can say the same if you have passion for filmmaking and so on and so forth. One good thing about being a scientist is, of course, getting a faculty job or any kind of research position is tough. Getting there requires that you slog through your years of field work or bench work or whatever else that you're doing. But once you get a faculty job, there are very few instances in which people can actually stop you from doing work, right? So as long as you don't end up in one of those really bad situations, and most scientists don't experience that, I will give you that as well. As long as you don't have that kind of a serious problem, normally nobody can stop you from doing whatever you want, right? And for me particularly, I feel fortunate. If you have to be in molecular biology, or if you have to be in, let's say, a physicist who needs some massive infrastructure worth $1 billion, you're definitely not going to be able to do that in a big group where you might face all sorts of political considerations, institutional considerations, and financial considerations. The beauty about being an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist is that you can always go to a forest, you can always go to any natural area, or even your backyard, right? You could find a spider in your backyard that might be really interesting. By the way, 2 weeks ago, I was in Pune and I saw this amazing, absolutely brilliant golden spider. And it was shining more brilliantly than gold. I've seen enough gold in my life to know how brilliant gold can be. And I will tell you that this spider was probably many times more brilliant than gold. The same color as gold, but much more brilliant. I don't work on spiders. Yeah. But the first thought I had was, how is it that a spider can be so brilliant? How do they make this color? And to ask that kind of questions, and perhaps even to find that question, that answer, you don't need a lot of money. You don't need big laboratory infrastructure. You do need something, yes. You can always start with a microscope, or you can always start with some other technology which is not more expensive or which is not inaccessible to you, and you can build up. Or you could ask really simple questions like, why does a butterfly not probe every single flower? And we actually ended up publishing a paper And fortunately, Watway shepherded this in a very different direction. We formalized 2, 3 hypotheses. There were other students who joined in this query, and then there were, I think, 6 or 7 PhD students and Watway sir. So we all together published a paper, and that really did not need any money at all. All the observation that needed to be taken, students had done that. So they used to go out to watch insects and plants and birds and whatever else every single weekend. And on these weekends, because now they had a good question to address, they would go to the forest and start taking observations in a notebook. And then we analyzed those data and wrote a very interesting paper, which has been cited fairly well. So you could always ask this kind of questions. That may be a privilege, luxury, which not every scientist has. But fortunately, I have that. Most ecologists and evolutionary biologists have that. So the brief answer to how do we keep our passion and motivation to do this is, nature. You can always go out, you can always have a very nice sunset or a sunrise that you could watch. And when you're sitting there, I think all the burdens of the world, your colleague is mean to you, you haven't got the grant that in which you put in a lot to put in the application, somebody else got the grant, or maybe somebody else published a more prestigious paper, or whatever else it is. You can always go to a forest, chase a wonderful butterfly like Kaiseri Hen, and feel happy about it. And I personally still derive most of my inspiration from watching these things in the field. And this is what I look forward to most of the time, and that is what keeps me sane. That is what keeps me happy. That is what keeps me excited about going to the field, going to the lab after that, because there are always things that I want to pursue back in the lab and in the museum, and talking to my students. That is what really gives me a lot of strength and focus. And actually, I should say something about the last sentence. Students, not necessarily students who work in my lab, but young people I meet, young people I can guide, young people who come to me with questions. That is another thing which keeps me going, because it always reminds me how I was. Yeah, I can see what people can turn into, and that's always a very nice thing. And whenever I meet young people who have passion, I can see that they're struggling. I can see that perhaps they're not struggling uh, uh, to for resources or for questions, but they might struggle just because they're not experienced enough to perhaps develop that question, develop that observation into a nice query. So that is what I then try to do, and I've helped a lot of people. I think early on I saw Muktai in this crowd, if not other people. There is Monica Gandhi, who is interning in my lab right now. So she is again a young student. So these are kinds of people who keep coming to my lab, and that is what drives my lab a lot. All right, I'll take the next question. Rosette asks how to start a project work in theoretical ecology if a person is not having any experience. How are skills? What are the skills required? So, Rosette, I don't know where you are from. If you're from India, I can point to a few good theoretical biologists that you can learn modeling from, or you can talk to them about the interesting questions that you have, and they can point you to the kinds of modeling skills that you need to develop, whether you need to model in any kind of a regular structured language, whether you even need modeling to answer the kind of theoretical questions that you want to address. People like Darwin and Wallace and many others were not theoretical biologists as we recognize them now, but the ideas that they had, that they put down in really long, winding passages, have led to dozens, if not hundreds, of theoretical papers, right? So you don't necessarily need skills as a mathematician or as a theoretical ecologist to be able to address those, but you certainly need to have abstract thinking. There was a scientist called Ronald Fisher, and there's a very funny story that Anil Gore, who was a statistician and head of the department in statistics department in Pune University, one of my heroes among scientists. And he's retired now, but he has been influential in my life. He never taught me anything directly, but boy, I've learned so much from him. Uh, being a person, being a scientist, and being an interesting person above all. So Anil Gore once told me that he was talking to some biologist, and they got into discussion about who was Ronald Fisher. So Anil Gore knew him as a statistician, and he kept saying, "No, no, no, he's a statistician. You're mistaken that he's a biologist. Maybe there was another Fisher who was a famous biologist." And the biologist said, "No, there was a biologist called Ronald Fisher, lived in England in this period, did this kind of work." And as they were talking to each other, they realized that it was the same person. Yeah? And Ronald Fisher has fundamental contributions to both evolutionary biology and to statistics. Fisher's test, you must have heard of Fisher's alpha. Yeah, that is that Fisher. And then you might have heard of Fisher's geometric model of evolution, where Fisher showed that or propose that when you're going towards an adaptive peak, and if you don't know what adaptive peak is, don't worry about it right now. But if you have a phenotype which will increase your fitness, then initially mutations with a big fitness effect will be selected. And as you climb this fitness peak, mutations of smaller and smaller effect are more likely to be selected. So he has this geometric model of what is the impact of a mutation on a fitness, what you will observe. And there are so many theories, so many hypotheses, so many ideas based on the framework that he built either in statistics or in evolutionary biology, by which he is known. So he had a very interesting thing to say. And now remember, Fisher was trained as a statistician. Fisher had amazingly high level abstract thinking. So you would think that a person who was so strong in mathematics and statistics and who had such a strong high level abstract thinking, you would think that he would not be very favorable to going out in the field and accumulating observation for 100 years before you even come up with an abstract thought. But what he wrote in his book was pretty amazing. He said there are two kinds of scientists who can have big contributions. You could either ask a very abstract question which has nothing to do in reality. For example, you could ask, why is it that there are only two sexes in nature, male and female? Why are there not 100 sexes, right? So you're not even bothered about what is out there in nature. You could ask an abstract question, how many sexes could you have, right? And then you could approach it completely as a theoretical question. You could also ask, is sex needed? Could you not just have a completely asexual population? And you could start with that. So you could build an entire ecosystem, an entire organism out of your brain about how it could function. And then you say, okay, if an organism has to function this way, it has to have these properties. Can these properties coexist? What are the parameters you want to assign to these properties, and so on and so forth. So you could just build this completely theoretical, completely abstract framework to address a question, or you could start from your dozens upon dozens of years of decades of your observations. And as you are accumulating your observations, you are synthesizing all your observations into well-formed ideas, and then you could ask brilliant questions. So the kinds of brilliant scientists that Darwin and Wallace and others were, and by any parameter that you can define, a lot of philosophers, a lot of theoreticians, a lot of scientists, a lot of other kinds of people have agreed that Darwin was one of the most influential scientists, not just biologists, not just evolutionary biologists, but one of the most influential scientists in the history of modern sciences, and somebody who has one of the biggest impacts as a scientist on the society, right? So that is the kind of impact that we are talking about. And as I mentioned, none of these people ever wrote an equation. None of these people ever had a completely abstract idea, the kind that Fisher was talking about. So you could have completely different approaches and you could come up with a brilliant framework. So, Rosette, again, going back to your question, how to start a project work in theoretical ecology? You don't have to have any experience, but you do need to be able to demonstrate that you have abstract thinking, or at least you have very interesting thinking. So depending on where you're from, I can tell you who you could approach. In India, for example, you could talk to Sandeep Krishna, who's a faculty member in my institute. Really great person, a very good theoretical biologist who has published very well. So you could get advice from him. He works in multiple fields. He has done a little bit of ecology and evolution, but he also does work in other areas. If you are coming more from the cell biology, molecular biology kind of field, Madan Rao, who's also another faculty member from our institute, is another great person you could talk to. If you're more tending towards ecology, field ecological problems, for example, you have Vishu Guttal in Center for Ecological Sciences in Indian Institute of Science. So there are a few really good theoretical ecologists in India and theoretical biologists in India on the whole. And in Europe and North America, you have many more. There are some brilliant population geneticists in Australia, for example. So depending on what kind of theory you want to do and where you are, I can point to a number. You can perhaps email me and I can perhaps write to you about that. All right, Srinidhi Maheshi, a role of science in society. Man, that's a very good question. But I'll see if there are other people who have asked similar questions, and then we'll get to this. Before I go on, I will actually just quickly ask Pavitra if you know how to take out a few questions that either have been addressed or we don't want to discuss
Yeah.
this. So you can either dismiss them or delete them if they have
Yeah.
been addressed.
So
That I think newer questions can stay on top.
yeah. So
Okay, so Srinidhi, really good question. I'll come back to it after I see if anybody else has other things to ask
so there
about.
was, 1 second. So there was a question from YouTube where someone wanted to know how you take your photographs. What
Okay,
lens you use for wildlife
sure.
photography and camera and everything.
Sure, sure. Uh, Arna has asked, what about silkworms? I will not address that question right now because I will get to questions that more people may be interested in. We have raised silkworms in our lab, and those are quite a lot of fun. They're easy to grow, and of course, they're a great model system to study for genetics and perhaps even molecular biology and development. But anyway, we'll address that kind of questions later. Gaurav asks, Masters in Zoology, preparing for CSR Net. Question is consciousness related to proteomics. Oh boy, that is again a minefield, really, but it does tap into this question of what does science mean to society. Consciousness is something that scientists are, of course, interested in. There's a lot of work in neurobiology in that field, and of course, our spiritual tradition in India, in China, in so many other countries and on different continents. Spiritualists have always thought and wondered about consciousness, and in their own way. For example, all these sadhus and gurus that you find in India, they have experimented with consciousness and built a lot of understanding. So this is again a question which is related to that. I won't go into chromosomes and proteomics, but I will deal with this question of what does scientific understanding do to questions or areas of great societal interest. So we'll get to that just a minute. Evolution of complex interspecific relationships, especially parasitism, mutualism. Unfortunately, It's a specific question. It's asking me about evolution of complex relationships. Actually, it's also not a specific question because it says insights. So I could pretty much say anything I like. So maybe I will ignore that for now. We'll keep that question there. But later on, if people want to come back to this, we'll come back to that. How do you actually determine if a species is novel just by looking at it first sight? So by novel, Venkatesh means how do you know that it's an undescribed species? And I will get to that as well. Let's see. Um, are there butterfly hotspots in India that you would suggest? So I'll get to the butterfly questions after I talk about science and society. And even if Pavitra has said that we have only 10 minutes, of course, we can go on for a little bit longer talking about butterflies. I mean, I can talk about butterflies for days on end. And I have, in fact, talked about butterflies and field and other things for 3 hours straight when I was supposed to have finished my lunch in 20 minutes. So I'm known to do that. We won't go on for 3 hours today, but we can certainly go on for another 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, talking about butterflies. So science and society, I'll take that question because it's really interesting. That's one of the main questions which scientists keep getting asked all the time. And if you're a politician, if you're an economist, if you are the head of the institute, you whoever who needs to justify funding for science keep getting these questions asked. If you're a student who wants to do something which will help the society, but perhaps in a scientific way, using scientific methods, then of course you would ask that question because you want to do something where you want to do not one or the other, but you want to do both. For example, if you want to know how to reach water to remote places in the desert where there's no water, right? It's a very fundamental humanitarian question, and it's also an interesting engineering question. So you will have to learn some science and engineering before you can address that. If you want to help people, for example, shield against COVID, which is the latest raging thing, or any other parasite, any other infection, you will want to know enough biology to address that question. So you could always think of ways in which you could do science and do something which is helping society. In more ecological evolutionary sciences, of course, um, evolution of pathogens like COVID or malaria or anything else is something that is very much firmly in the realm of evolutionary biology. In ecology, for example, impact of climate change on survival of species, on preservation of species, on persistence of species in nature is one really hot topic. How to preserve biodiversity at the same time allowing a nation like India, a developing nation like India, to grow in infrastructure, in um, growth in other sectors. How do you allow that to happen? How do you allow people to have slightly higher living of higher standard of living, have more resources at their disposal, not at such an expense to nature and wildlife and biodiversity that you're not going to have some species versus beyond, let's say, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years from now on. So these are the kinds of questions that an ecologist can tackle. Maybe we can find areas to connect populations. Maybe you can find ways to make an insect species, a butterfly species, persist in an area where its host plant has been decimated. Can you do selective breeding? Can you feed these butterflies in on some other host plant that may occur somewhere else in the world, which is why the butterfly will go extinct if you don't do something about this situation where the native host plant has gone extinct, but you can discover a host plant which is similar to the species, which can be acceptable to the butterfly. By doing research, you can find those things out, right? So that way you can help a butterfly cope up with certain pressures. For example, you can imagine that the native host plant was a species of plant that humans wanted to harvest as well. And of course, when humans want to harvest something and another species wants to depend on it, as is the case in this butterfly, then you're certainly not going to be able to win that argument, because people will always say, this is important to us, this can make medicine, this can make whatever else that people want to harvest that species for. But then you could, for example, come up with an alternative host plant for this species that you can establish, which people may not want to harvest. So you can always think of really interesting ways in which science can help society. One of my favorite discoveries recently, this is in Africa, and I don't know why this kind of interesting questions have not been asked in India by Indian scientists. This is where I think we need to shape up. We need to say that there are real problems in India that we want to solve, and they don't have to be expensive options. They don't have to be options where government has to get involved or government has to give out a big funding grant, research grant. So I'll explain to you what this research was. Like in India, there's of course a lot of human-animal conflict um, in the sense that in Africa, for example, lions kill a lot of cattle of these herders. And lion is a much bigger animal than, let's say, a wild dog or a wolf in India. And because they live in a pride, most of them at least, when a lion wants to kill something, it just doesn't want to kill a small calf, or it doesn't want to kill just one buffalo. Ideally, lions have to hunt every other day, every 3, 4 days. If you have killed something big, they can go on for a week, but they're not going to go hungry for too longer than that. So they have to hunt big animals. So if wild prey has already been decimated, and then lions find perhaps cattle much easier to hunt and then eat, because they're so defenseless compared to, let's say, a wild buffalo, which can withstand an attack from a lion pride. So what this team of ecologists, and probably there were some other people involved in this as well, maybe some social scientists involved, what they discovered was that if you paint a face-like marking on cattle, then lions are a little bit intimidated. And this idea itself is not new. If you have heard this before, people in Sundarbans, for example, when they go out to the field to get honey or whatever else that they want to harvest from these areas where tigers still exist, and this is traditional knowledge. People have done this for decades, at least, if not hundreds of years. So people would go with a mask attached to the back of their head on which they have painted a face, right? And Indians have been using it for a long time. So that has some effect, and people had known this. What this African team did was they put similar markings on the backs of, on the rumps of the cattle, on the backs of the cattle, and they did tried various things. They just had a circle, a square, some random pattern, and then they had rounds inside those. So if you have a round with two small rounds inside, which in some sense might represent a face, yeah, the small rounds are going to be eyes in a frame of a face, right? It doesn't look anything like a human face. It doesn't look anything like an animal face. It's just one round in which you have two small rounds with some vague resemblance to a face, if you really want to think about it. So they had these cattle which did not have these markings on their sides, mixed in with cattle which had markings on their sides. And then they asked, you have these two types of cattle. There are 100 cattle. Some have been painted, others have not been painted, or some have been painted which with markings which do not look like a face. Yeah? And what they found out was that cattle which were painted with these face-like markings had lower mortality, I think over several weeks or perhaps months, compared to cattle which had random markings like a triangle, which has absolutely no resemblance to a face, or cattle which had no markings at all. Now, here's a very simple research, ecological research, behavioral research, you might want to call it, which addresses a very interesting conservation problem and a very interesting social problem. You don't want these herders to suffer from their cattle being eaten by lions. It's traumatic for the cattle, it's traumatic for the herders. And of course, when herders get really mad when this keeps happening, because the lions will keep coming back to this herd because it's easy prey, and then they will go out and hunt lion. So it's a conservation problem as well. So all around, if you are an animal welfare person who wants to work towards welfare of cattle, you don't want cattle being torn apart by a wild animal. You don't want the herder to be sad because this poor herder has just lost, 10% of the cattle to a lion pride, and you don't want the lion to be killed by people who are mad. So, if you really want to address questions which have interesting implications and interesting solutions, low cost solutions, solutions which nobody can argue against, who will say that no, you should not do this, you should not paint cattle with this, right? So, lions will be a little bit intimidated and then they will go off and perhaps chase some other animals, some wild animals, perhaps. Even if they have to run, even if they have more work to do, at least they will do that because they have an innate fear of a face, right? This is a great discovery. If you think about it, this is a great discovery because what it tells you is that you do not have to have expressions and precise uh, features of a face. All you need is a big circle with two smaller circles in between, right? Inside it. That tells you something about the psychology of predators, isn't it? It doesn't have to have some body form on top of which predators might expect a head or on side of which predators might expect a head. They see the shape of a face on the rump of a cattle, either when predators are looking at the cattle from behind or from the side, and they feel intimidated. Isn't it something great that tells you about psyche of predators, including us? Uh, Scientifically, I find that very exciting. And as a conservation solution to a problem, I find it very exciting. That is, I think, what scientists can do and what science can do for society. So, in brief, I've tried to address all these questions about work of a scientist being used by people in power for their own benefit or for others. But actually, Srini's question is a little bit different as well. He was also asking how will they be, how will they misuse it. So I only told you about how they will use it, and I will not tell you about the misuse because you see it all the time. So the reason why Srinidhi asked this question itself means that sure, we know that politicians and others can misuse it. How should scientists respond? Unfortunately, we don't have too much power to change policy directly or do other things. But more you talk to politicians, more you go out and talk to people, I think it has an impact. And one of the things that I've realized, one of the reasons why we are having this program at all is the fact that when you talk to people, actually, if you have seen my post, it says that scientists appear to be so aloof, so far away in their ivory towers that people don't feel connected to them. And maybe people do want answers from scientists. Often, I do know that people look up to scientists. I looked up to scientists when I was a kid, right? So society hasn't changed much as recently as 3, 4 months ago. I've heard from somebody that, oh, you're scientists. We literally look at you as our God. And this was, by the way, a forest official telling me. And I was shocked because I always keep hearing that forest officers don't like scientists. Scientists have a lot of problems with forest officers. I've rarely felt that. Whenever I've gone to forest officers, they have always treated me nicely. And when this forest officer said this to me, I realized how much people value scientists and their opinions and what their discoveries have to say. So one of the biggest things I will tell you, if you're a practicing scientist or if you're in any other position where you can make a change, Pavitra, for example, who is moderating this session, is a communications person, and Pavitra and Chandrakant, another moderator here, another communications person at NCBS. Thanks, by the way, guys, for organizing this and for shepherding this and coming up with all these ideas and facilitating this. We really need to talk to people. People need to talk to scientists, and we need to build up this understanding of What is the use and misuse of scientific information? If there are real issues like a pandemic or this human wildlife conflict or anything else, what do we do to solve these problems, especially in our capacity as a scientist, as a person? And I will tell you one thing. Are people using science badly? Yes. This is a really bad example, and this should wake you up if you're an ecologist or a conservation biologist. Many years ago in Brazil, there's a small patch of forest where there were maybe 7 or 8 jaguars, and that forest land was going to be developed. People had their eyes on this forest land. Developers, politicians, and even people who could have built and occupied houses there wanted this area gone. The forest gone, I mean, and houses built, agricultural fields developed, and so on and so forth. So they consulted scientists, and scientists were talking to them, and these guys were really smart, these politicians and builders. When scientists said, jaguar is a highly endangered species, and there is a population of jaguars, these breed here, so it's really bad if you develop this because then we are destroying a habitat of an endangered species. But these guys said, oh, but according to the population genetics models that you have, the minimum viable population size that you want to have for a species is 100 animals. So this population is already doomed. There are 7, 8 animals right now, but they don't really have an evolutionary future. So according to your own models and according to your own work, this population is doomed, and therefore we shouldn't care about this population. You might feel emotional about this population and these 7, 8 jaguars which exist there, but because it has no evolutionary future, they're going to go away anyway. Why don't we go ahead and build it anyway? I mean, this is one of the worst nightmares that a scientist or conservationist that they could have, right? That your own research is going to be turned against you. And the reason why I would classify this as a misuse and not a use or not a logical thing is that when we say 100 animals is what you will need for a population to have, this is sort of a number which many studies have arrived at. Now, the prey and predator animals, of course, will want to have different population sizes because there's a particular structure. Uh, a lot of predators, for example, a male might have a bigger territory than several females, which might occupy parts of the male's territory, and a male may mate with all the females which occur in that area, where that is not the system in, let's say, a mouse or a deer. So the number of animals that are considered a viable population size. And then there's a concept of effective population size. So there's a lot of theory, a lot of population genetics that goes into it, a lot of evolutionary theory that goes into it. So 100 is not a hard and fast number, but this is what will have a long-term evolutionary future, meaning that if you're looking at population splitting, populations adapting to changing climate, to changing habitats, and so on and so forth, this is the minimum population that you need. But we do know that a single gravid female, if she gets onto an island, she can start a new population. This is how most of the island populations start. One or two, or just a very few number of gravid females, egg carrying females, or baby carrying females get to an island and then they start, or go to a new continent and then start a new population. And that might turn into a species and an entire genus and an entire family. So it's not that small populations don't have any future, but if you're looking at a flourishing of a clade, if you're looking at speciation event, if you are looking at bad uh, population surviving through really bad shocks to the system, then you need so much genetic variation to be able to deal with that, right? That is what the theory says. But then this is a twisting of the theory. And of course, Hitler used natural selection to justify his actions. Stalin used natural selection to justify his actions. So you'll see that they've misused this left and right. As a scientist, as a thinker, what you can do is talk to people, talk to students, talk to politicians, and say this is what it is. And one of the main reasons why I like to engage with people, and I will urge you, if you want to be a teacher, if you want to be in a field where you will be able to talk to young people, absolutely go into that field that has value like nothing else you can imagine. Because imagine you're talking to people who might go into all sorts of fields. You might have a small kid which you might not think much of. That kid may not have any spark of anything that you can think of, but maybe that kid is going to become a politician. Maybe that kid is going to become an IAS officer. These are the people who control our policies. These are the people who control futures of our species and ecosystems, and even our lives through monitoring or through controlling environmental legislation, for example. So you should really get into areas where you're going to have a very broad impact on what people think and what people know. So a teacher, for example, can have a huge impact on what happens to their kids. And if you teach them about science really well, if you instill a love of experimentation, if you instill a love of reading and thinking, I think these things are going to have a big impact on the society. So, as scientists, I will tell you, if you want to start a program in your area, I may not be able to go to every single area and every single group which wants to have me, but at least I can point to people who can have that kind of, who can do that kind of programs for you. I can talk to, let's say, politicians or forest officials. They don't have to be politicians necessarily. Policymakers are also into forest department, ministry of environment and forest, that kind of areas, that kind of agencies, government agencies. So you can always engage with them. And I will tell you, in Karnataka, for example, the Karnataka forest department is doing amazing work. I really love what they're doing. In fact, I will say you will hear a lot of people talking about conservation. There are lots of famous conservationists in Bangalore area, in Karnataka, in India, who are so well known, way more well known than, let's say, the best forest officers you might have known or not known. These people in the forest department are having a way bigger impact than any noise that any conservationist is going to make. These conservationists are on TV or on news all the time, but these forest officials are the ones who are putting their head down every single day, going to their office, facing really tough questions from politicians, from builders, from scientists, from conservationists, everybody. They are really the true heroes if you're talking about conservation. They have to manage the forest, they have to stop encroachment, they have to do so many things. So don't focus on one or two corrupt officials you might know. And in Karnataka, I haven't seen any so far. I don't think that you're not going to find any, but the majority I've seen are really good. Go engage with them. If you're a scientist, don't sit in your ivory tower. Even if you're a student, go ask a forest officer in your area, can I make you a nice poster for your wildlife sanctuary? Can I help you with documenting, let's say, all the birds in your area, all the insects in your area, all the trees in your area? You can always do something to help them, to strengthen their arguments, why we need to preserve a forest, why we need to perhaps let people go into forests or not get people kicked out. If you're a conservationist, you might also think that people don't belong in forests. We should have exclusively wildlife areas. And I would have agreed perhaps when I was young, but I will not agree with you at this point, because recently I've been going to Rajasthan, going to Gujarat, going to Maharashtra, and boy, I go to these areas, you meet a shepherd in a field, in an agricultural field, and in 5 minutes you see a wolf. India is a kind of a mosaic where wildlife and biodiversity and people have existed for so long. You cannot think that you can either have people or animals in the forest or forest on a piece of land. We really have to engage with forest departments, preserve these small patches with abundant biodiversity there. And that is one way you can help as a scientist, as a student, as anybody really who is passionate about things and who has any information about anything. You can go to people in the municipality. They don't even have to be forest officers. It's how you talk to them, right? If you go to a municipality official, if you go to your local MLA and say, we really like butterflies, we have a park here, and we would like to develop that as a butterfly garden. We would like to plant trees which are good for butterflies. We would like to make some boards, for example, which will tell people what kind of butterflies to expect in that area, and then have these plants where people can go and look at caterpillars. What kind of people will say, no, you cannot do this in the parks in the city, right? But instead of planting a lot of exotic plants, if you plant trees and shrubs and herbs in your neighborhood garden, which are friendly to our own biodiversity rather than planting exotic plants, it is going to be good for biodiversity, as it is going to be good for all the kids and old people who come to the garden. And it's going to be good for the city because people are engaged with the park, they want it there. And the fact that people are volunteering to say, I have information either as a scientist, as a student, as whatever, and you're helping them. These are win-win solutions that you can think of. So have a positive attitude, think of interesting questions that you can address, interesting problems that you can solve. And if you're a scientist, you can take this thinking at any level and try to help society to counter all this misuse of science or ignorance of science or what's the word, neglect of science. So I'll stop there because it's 1 hour 20 minutes. I see that there are multiple questions. I'll maybe hang on for another 10-15 minutes, but it's been fun talking to you guys, and perhaps we should have another session maybe in a few months or next year. And I'm pretty sure many other scientists would also like to engage in this kind of discussion. I noticed there were probably 26, 27 attendees at the beginning, and we still have 23, which is not bad. So I hope that you have enjoyed this as much as I have enjoyed. I know I haven't been able to address all the questions, but this shouldn't be the end of conversation. I'm pretty sure Pavitra and Chandrakant will organize this kind of programs in the future. And they have actually already done this with Deepa and Dimple, I think. Those two other faculty members from NCBS, they discussed a number of issues, a number of stories with I think female students. Maybe it was a girls' school. I don't remember, but it was definitely a school, and they have chatted with those students. So a lot of us are interested in this. We will have this sort of programs. Just stay tuned with NCBS Communications Office, and I'm pretty sure there'll be other opportunities. And I see this Tejas Mahendra. There are several other people. Umka Damle from our groups. Abhinav Nair. Hi guys, I haven't been able to take your questions or say hi to you before, but I'm glad that you came, and do spread the word around, and we will have this sort of programs. Thanks, Pavitra, and please take on. After you chat with them, I think I would like to stay on for another 10-15 minutes. But if you want to log off, you're welcome to.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say that there are some of the overlapping questions, and some people want your email ID.
Mhm.
So perhaps I can share that in the chat.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's all. You can continue, no problem.
Great. All right, so let's see. How to overcome disease in queen butterflies. I think there's background noise coming from somebody's device. Anyway, Rashida Sarbar, I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So Rashida has this question, how to overcome disease in queen butterflies. Unfortunately, queen butterflies don't occur in India. Queen butterflies occur in, actually there are two butterflies I know which are called queen. There's an African queen butterfly, which of course occurs in Africa. And then there's a queen butterfly in North America. Both of them belong to the same genus, Danaus. It's the same genus in which we have plain tiger and striped tiger butterfly and several other butterflies. So we don't have queen butterfly in India, but we do have relatives of that. And the kinds of diseases that you see in those butterflies occur in India as well. How do you overcome this disease? Of course, the butterfly has to fight it. We can't really help them do this. This is a wild species which has to resist the pathogen on its own. Now, interestingly, in the last 15, 20 years, there has been a lot of work on medicines used by insects. And of course, there is no doctor. Of course, there is no understanding that something is a medicine. The way we think of evolution and evolution of behaviors is that if there's a behavior caused by a particular variant of a gene, let's say, then if you have that behavior which is adaptive, which is going to help you survive and reproduce, then that mutation will be perpetuated, or at least it has a high chance of being perpetuated through generations. So let's say you have a caterpillar which has a habit of gnawing at something which doesn't taste good. Now, typically, what are the plants which taste good? Plants which are not going to be bad for you, right? Plants which might in fact be nutritious for you. And what are typically plants which taste horrible? If you take the human example, typically things that taste horrible to you are things that are not food, things that you don't want to eat, things that are even going to be harmful for you, right? So if you have this behavior, a gene which causes this behavior when you are sick, when you're infected, you're going to gnaw at something which does not taste nice. Then that gene will spread in the population. So when we say medicine, we don't mean that insects know something is medicinal and they're going to eat. But the observation is true that many insects eat plants or plant parts, which they normally don't eat, but they eat them only when they're infected with something specific. And in some cases, it has been shown that if these insects start eating certain plants or certain plant parts at certain developmental stage of those plant parts, the compounds which occur in those plant parts act as a medicine for that particular insect. And this is where a lot of insect medicine, natural medicine in insects has come up in the last 15, 20 years. And many butterflies do, many insects do show that, including some butterflies and moths. So when you say how can a queen butterfly overcome this disease, either it has to have some innate defenses built up. Either its cells can change in such a way that, let's say, a virus or a bacterium finds it hard to get inside a cell, or it has to have this kind of a natural medicine around in its environment and this behavior to eat that, so that when it's sick, it can go and eat this and then get all right. So that's an interesting question, not relevant to the species that you asked for, but certainly interesting for any insect or any organism in which you may not think of medicine, but there are, of course, diseases, and this is how you can sort of deal with this. All right. Consciousness related to proteomics, I'm going to ignore that now. Let's say anonymous attendee, are there any butterfly hotspots in India that you would suggest? This question was there earlier actually, so I will address this question. Yes, there are multiple. I love these. I'm actually going to go to one of those in 2 weeks. There are four formally designated biodiversity or formally identified biodiversity hotspots in India. The Western Ghats and Sri Lanka is one. Himalaya is another. Himalaya north of Brahmaputra River is technically identified as Himalaya biodiversity hotspot. The third biodiversity hotspot is Northeast India and Andaman Islands. And the fourth biodiversity hotspot is Nicobar Islands, which is part of the Indo-Malayan biodiversity hotspot. So these are the four formally designated biodiversity hotspots among 30 plus, which have been identified in the world. But of course, we think of Andaman Nicobar Islands as one island group. For political purposes, for social purposes, for travel purposes, we do see them as one entity. But Andaman and Nicobar Islands have very different floras and faunas. Very different, I should say, very different. There's, of course, a lot of overlap, but they are distinct enough that they have been identified with larger biodiversity hotspot. Andamans has been pooled with what is called a Burmese biodiversity or Indo-Burmese biodiversity hotspot, which includes only the northeastern part of it and then the Andaman part of it. The rest of it is Myanmar and predominantly Myanmar. I think some part of Indochina also is included in it. And then, of course, Nicobars goes with Indomalaya because birds like megapode, for example, occur on occur on Nicobars, but not in Andamans. There are plants which do that. There are butterflies which do that. There are several insect species which do that. So technically, that has been identified. Nicobars has been identified as part of Andamans. So these are formally identified biodiversity hotspots. Within these areas, you can go to so many spots which are superb in the Indo-Myanmar biodiversity hotspot, which includes Northeast India, Garo Hills, Khasi Hills, Naga Hills. These are my favorite. They're so exciting. Another reason why I find them very exciting is that the tribal culture there, the number of tribes there is still not bad. Tribal communities still hold a large proportion of land. In Nagaland, I think even now, more than 90% of the state land is under tribal land. So the tribes legally have the right to that land. Only 10% or less is under forest department and other government structures. Same thing with Garo Hills, same thing with Khas Hills. Even now, most of the forest that you see is there. So you not only get to see great butterflies and other things that you might be interested in, you also meet very interesting people, very unlike us, living a life very unlike us, having the kind of connection to the forest very unlike us. So it's great fun for me, not just watching butterflies, but also when I come back to interact with these people. When we go to the forest, we take some young people from these communities with us, so that they can not only show us the paths, but also take us to some interesting areas, and also participate in the interesting things that we are doing. I'll actually show you. This is the second item which I had not really thought of showing you, but now that we are in conversation, I will show you. In 2013, we published this book called Butterflies of the Garo Hills. Yeah? This has 5 people involved. And before this, we had a paper written up, Butterflies of Garo Hills. And on that, I think we had 2 or 3 more authors. One of the authors on that paper was a local guy, a tribal guy. Sangma was his name. What Sangma? I'll remember the name. So he was really part of this team. And we included him not only in the surveys, but also we taught him some butterflies. We gave him, of course, copies of this book. I'm hoping to meet him when I go there next month. And he was so good. He really learned to identify butterflies. So after our field trips, whenever people went there to watch butterflies, he would lead the trails. And of course, he earned some money. But he also actually did very nice things for butterflies in his areas. He would tell other people about it. He will tell them not to disturb areas where butterflies come for mud puddling, to take up this salt water and other things, nectar plants. So he was then a voice for conserving these things that normally tribal people don't talk about. They will, of course, talk about hornbills, they'll talk about elephant, they will talk about small things that they either use or have interesting things that they have observed, or things that they're afraid of, snakes, for example. But butterflies, many other insects that they don't eat, they don't really think about. But once they know there's something interesting there, once they know people come and look for these things, they find them interesting, they want to see these conserved, then these people will feel, okay, let's do something to help these small insects as well, or trees and whatever else that they see has intrinsic value beyond what their culture has already valued them for. So this is one of the things that I like about doing field work in these areas, because the tribal communities are still pretty strong there, which is not the case. For example, if you go to, let's say, Corbett National Park, or if you go to Kana National Park, There may be tribals around, but you're not going to interact with them. The forest department doesn't want them in the forest the same way that these people have been in the forest, and the same way that tourists go around in the forest, right? So one of the best things I like about fieldwork in these biodiversity hotspots is this human angle, which I find very close to my heart. And of course, butterflies, butterflies something is something that you know me for. So Garo Hills has amazing butterflies. They a little bit higher up towards Khas Hills. You have Bhutan glories. You have other glorious butterflies. And man, that one place, Garo Hills, the Bagmar area where we go, has more than 500 species. So you go to 100 square kilometer or 200 square kilometer area, and you have more than 500 species. You can watch butterflies, you can chase butterflies, you can photograph butterflies to your heart's content, and you're still not going to be done. No matter how long you live there, you can live there for a year, and that's not going to be enough. You can live there for a lifetime, and that's not going to be enough. So Garu Hills, I will tell you, in eastern Himalaya, Meha Wildlife Sanctuary is spectacular. Mauling Wildlife Sanctuary is amazing. Tale Wildlife Sanctuary in Arunachal Pradesh near Zero is one of the most mind-blowing places I've seen. Pake Wildlife Sanctuary is great. Dehing Wildlife Sanctuary in Assam is another really wonderful place I know. In West Bengal, you have Nevra Valley, you have Baksa Tiger Reserve, amazing places for butterflies, amazing places for elephants, for birds, for snakes, for forests in general. If you want to watch really beautiful sunsets, that's an area. So there are all these things which are quite nice. And in the Western Ghats, Coorg area, of course, is my favorite. Honey Valley area is quite spectacular. Shendurni Wildlife Sanctuary area is amazing. Hattekad is great for birds. And because I don't do just butterflies, you know me for butterflies because that's what I publish most of the time. And of course, we run this really nice, very popular website called Butterflies of India. But of course, I watch birds, I do a bunch of other things. So I will tell you, I will show you a few things that I've seen recently. Just a minute, let me put this up. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, I hope that you can see my screen now. This is one of my latest pictures. In fact, I processed it today. These are two young stallions of Asiatic wild ass, which are fighting at sunset. Yeah. So this is in Gujarat. And as I said, going back to the question that Parag asked, you see something like this. There's a spectacular sunset. You're sitting in Little Run of Kutch. It's all flat, amazing land. It's very harsh during the day, but spectacular in the evening and in the morning. And if you really think about it, even in the harshness of the noon. So this is one of the things that I've really enjoyed recently. Just a minute. Let me go to the next picture. Here is another. This is also, by the way, on the same trip, Gujarat. This is an Imperial Eagle, which has just taken flight. But look at the feet. Look at the talents of this eagle. You don't want to mess with this. This has extreme power. Even if it's much smaller than you, let's say, if it really wants to go after you, it is going to cause some serious damage. So I saw this as well. It was amazing. Here is an emerald dove in Karwar in Dandeli Tiger Reserve. Here is another really wonderful species that I like. Here is a fox that I saw on a recent trip. Here is a male which was looking at us near its den, and these are its pups which had come out to play. And this one is yawning. So there are all these wonderful moments. So other favorite places, if I would say you don't have any particular agenda in going to a forest, to nature, and by agenda I mean you want to see a particular butterfly or a particular bird or a particular anything. If you just want to enjoy the beauty of nature, the beauty of uh, uh, ecosystems that you want to experience, I would say go to Gujarat, go to Rajasthan, go to these very barren looking areas. Banni grasslands in Gujarat is one such area. Desert National Park area in Rajasthan is another area. You wouldn't think twice about these areas because they look so barren. You would think that there's not much wildlife. And then you see these wolves, you see these fox pups, you see really great flowers. There are lots and lots of great looking flowers in this area. And just the peace that you feel when you go there is stunning. And that is what I mean by if you don't have any particular agenda, if you just want to be, go to Gujarat, go to Banni grasslands. You will never forget that trip. And of course, can go to big areas, big famous areas like Kana National Park or Madumalai Tiger Reserve, for which you guys know me. I've written a book about my experiences there. So of course, you can go to all these places which are very well known, but try to go to some of these smaller places as well because there's no commercialization, or at least not as much. You're probably going to enjoy nature. You're going to enjoy butterflies a lot more. Uh, uh, it's the Castle Rock area for butterflies is pretty spectacular. Actually, Castle Rock Karwar area, I would say. Go to coastal lands. Not many people go to coastal forests. There are not too many left either. But go to coastal forests. The kinds of butterflies you will see and the kinds of experiences you could have. Oh, Yana. If you have not been to Yana, you really haven't seen the Western Ghats. You absolutely must go. Go to Joke Falls area and not to the falls area itself. Lots of people go there. But go to places like Yana, amazing rock formations. And then you walk through these rock formations. Trees are just coming out of these rocks. And then you will see some spectacular butterfly there. A tiny uh, Ropala, what do we call that in English? Our oak blues, which are so spectacular, so brilliant blue on the upper side, and it certainly flashes in front of you coming out of this cave. So you're already coming out of the cave. You're used to, your eyes have got used to a little bit of darkness, and you certainly come out of this cave and this brightness of the forest, which is not as bright as outside the forest for sure, but it's already bright. And then in this ray of sunshine, you see this brilliant blue butterfly just take off. It's seriously one of the best experiences you can have. And I challenge you not to smile when you see this, right? This just comes naturally. These are the kinds of experiences that you only can have in this kind of places. Go to Yana, go to Banni, go to Desert National Park, go to Pake Tiger Reserve. You will not forget those trips. Anyway, I'll just have one last look and see if there is any other question that I want to really quickly address, but it's 8:40, so we should really stop, unfortunately. Just a minute. Okay, then there are some technical questions like Srinidhi again is asking role of competition in plants and animals. And again, I can talk about this for a long time, but we'll stop those kinds of questions. I think other ecologists can also address, I can also address at another time. But I think I spoke more about things that I feel passionate about. For example, this experience of an oak blue flying in a patch of sunshine in the forest, right? Those are the kinds of things that I like, not just the theory, not just the uh, evolution part of it, ecology part of it, but there's a lot of other fun to do with being a scientist and being able to go to forests as well. Careers in wildlife post MSc. This is Abhinav Nair. Abhinav, you are already on several groups. Um, that we frequent on. So please just drop me an email another time or call me. My phone number is easy to find, and then we can chat about these things. For molecular studies, again, more technical, so we'll keep that aside for some time. As a naturalist, if you're faced with a situation where you would have to choose between the last member of a critically endangered species and a human life, what would your calling be? I'm not even going to answer that question. I think you know the answer. Yeah, so I'll stop there. All right, guys. Again, thanks a lot. If you want to unmute and say hello, if I haven't caught your name in this, you feel free to say that. I will just stay on for another minute if you want to say, if you want to unmute yourself and say hello. Um, I'm certainly very pleased to see several of you here. Parag, I don't know whether he's still here. If he's gone, it was great to see him. And of course, um, Rahul, Ranjan, others that who were here. Tejas Mendari is here. He's another person who has been in our extended group of butterfly watchers. So nice to see you guys. Uh, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krushnamegh.
Who is this?
Rahul.
Rahul. Okay. Hi.
Thank you so much. Lots of thanks. Such a wonderful answers of these questions.
Great. Okay, guys. I'll log off then. Had fun, and I hope to talk to you once again at Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Bye. And if you missed any part of this, you can go and watch it on YouTube.
Oh, Pavitra, you're still there. I'm happy about that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks so much,
Bye, everyone.
Krushnamegh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Krushnamegh. Have a good
Yes,
night.
Chandrakan. Thanks.
Bye bye.
Thank you.